What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Myriam Hadnes, and with the Workshops.work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is just myself. To celebrate 300 episodes, I thought it was time to reintroduce myself, share a little bit about the behind the scenes in terms of process and how I find the guests on the show, and all random stuff that crossed my mind. So I invite you to follow this maybe fun, maybe interesting solo episode to celebrate 300s. Thank you so much for your loyalty, and thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed, then scroll down to the show notes to subscribe to the show and visit the website that's in the show notes to explore the treasure trove of 300 episodes. Who would have thought that? And as I was wondering what kind of episode I want to record for 300 to celebrate this milestone, I realized that maybe it's been a while since I introduced myself. Many of you have known me as the interviewer every week. I have different guests, and very rarely I record a solo episode. It's only recently that I found more courage to keep the mic to myself. So today I want to take the opportunity to reintroduce myself, to share a little bit of who I am, why I'm hosting this podcast, what got me here, and also want to tell you about the process and how I find my guests and what the selection process maybe is and the behind the scenes, because I receive many questions and you might be curious. So here we go. Let's start at the beginning. Why did I start this podcast? It was actually in 2019. I was at a mastermind for entrepreneurs in London, and I just started my freelance business. I just started to call myself a facilitator. I was so proud of my elevator pitch, and everyone I introduced myself to went like, "A what? Are you a consultant? Are you a coach?" "No, I'm a facilitator, facilitate workshops." And this usually fell flat, mostly because people didn't hear about the word facilitator. The profession was not known to them. And when they thought of workshops, they thought of sticky notes falling off the wall and leaving with kind of an excitement, but nothing happening on Monday morning. So as I was at a mastermind and sharing my frustration of not feeling recognized and not being able to really introduce myself and the value proposition that I bring to the table, they very quickly landed on the one solution. "Myriam, you have to start a podcast. You have a good connection to people. You can keep conversations flowing. And yes, you want to promote this professional facilitation." So this was my amazing opportunity to not only create a marketing tool for the professional facilitators and the tool of workshops, but also an opportunity for me to expand my network. Because back then, I didn't really know many facilitators. And to be very honest, I thought that after 25 episodes, I would be done, because how many conversations can you have about facilitation, right? So here we are, 300 episodes later. And I still have a very long list of facilitators that I want to interview, that I will interview, that I already have interviewed and will publish over the next weeks. And the more conversations I have, the more curious I become. And what is actually very interesting is that when you listen to the very first episodes and the ones that I recently recorded, you will find a big difference. In the beginning, most of my questions were around the what and the how. So how do you do that? What activities are you using? How do you structure a workshop? Because I was new to the field, and I would say most of what I know about facilitation nowadays I have learned through the podcast and through my guests on the show and through the Never Done Before community, which also came to existence because of the podcast. But that's a different topic, and I will cover that later. Let me take a note so that I don't forget. So when I started calling myself a facilitator, I realized that my background in behavioral economics really, really helped me to designing spaces where collaboration can happen. Because as you might know, I have a PhD in behavioral economics, which is a field in economics where social psychology, economics, and in my case, even anthropology meet. I designed economic experiments to test human behavior of individuals and group dynamics under very specific circumstances to find out to what extent either external influences or internal mechanisms of motivation, for instance, or beliefs may impact economic behavior. I did most of my research and run experiments in Namibia, in Burkina Faso, and in Vietnam. And to design good economic experiments that would help us to really identify a causal effect between a trigger and a human behavior and a response, we really had to think about what is the context, what is the environment, what are the potential different factors that could influence human behavior, and how can we measure it? And very quickly I realized that to design workshops, we have to ask ourselves these exact same questions. So what is it that makes individuals feel safe, open up, be creative? What is it that makes individuals maybe become defensive? What is it in group dynamics that might create noise in behavior? So what are the causes for leadership bias, that suddenly an entire group would follow the opinion of one single person? So all these things really matter. And through my studies, I came to a state where all of this came natural to me. So basically, when I look at human interactions, it's always through the lens of behavioral economics and through the passion of designing experiments. So yeah, and with this background, I also came to the, and I never made a secret out of that. I came to the conclusion that any workshop is a practice of manipulation. We're creating environments where we manipulate participants to behave in a certain way. And I mean manipulation in the best meaning of the word. So manipulation is not to be confused with facilitation. We recorded podcast episodes on this topic, where facilitation means that we're using our facilitation skills to manipulate the outcome. So we are basically pushing the group to come up with specific predefined outcomes. And this is not what we are doing. What we are doing is to design processes that help individuals and groups to be more creative, more collaborative, more open, so that they can come up with outcomes and solutions that they would support and push forward after the workshop is done and after we have left. And while I invited for the first podcast episodes, my first degree network, maybe second degree. So Patrick Cowden was my very first guest. He has been my mentor, actually, for over 10 years now. I met him back in the days in Vietnam, where he hosted a workshop for my bachelor students as I was working for the Vietnamese German University in Vietnam. And we invited different professionals to help the bachelor students to get a better understanding of what leadership is and how they can grow into the management roles that they aspired. And Patrick Cowden came and he did the same workshop for the group of bachelor students and to a group of CEOs, CFOs, so higher leadership of German companies based in Ho Chi Minh City. And I think it was for me the first time that I saw what facilitation actually is and the beauty it can bring out of people. And we covered what he has done in episode 001. So if you're curious, please tune in. And we've been in touch ever since. So he came back on the show, I think, at least once more. What was funny in this first episode was that I wasn't prepared at all. So, yes, I was prepared in a way that I wrote down some questions that I wanted to ask Patrick. But I remember that the day before, I called a friend of mine whether he had a microphone that I could borrow because I didn't know how to get our voices onto the computer. And I Googled how to record a podcast episode via Zoom because I wasn't sure whether I could just record on Zoom or whether I had to use GarageBand and how all of this would come together. And at the end, it all worked out. I spent, I think, 5 hours editing the podcast episode. And it's not because I'm a bad editor, because GarageBand that I used back then was complicated. It was basically because I first deleted myself because I had the impression that I was constantly taking too much space, constantly thinking, that was a stupid question. No, this wasn't the answer that I expected. Oh, I took too much space. I explained too much. So I deleted all these bits and then realized that later on we would refer back to that. So I had to put them back in. And then there was so much noise in my mind, in my head, that at some point I just gave up and surrendered. I'm like, okay, this is good enough so that it could be published. And then most of the early episodes I actually recorded face to face. I very early bought a recorder, a Zoom recorder. It's 2 microphones. And funny enough, the microphone with which I'm recording now on Zoom is still the same that I used back then. In the meantime, I spent a small fortune on microphones, just realizing that very often it's not the price of a microphone that determines its quality. And very often it's not even the quality of a microphone that determines the quality of the recording, but it is the space in which you're sitting and how much it resonates. So now I have another tool in which I plug in my microphone so that the sound becomes more contained and sounds round. But I'm losing a little bit my track. So I started the podcast to build a network and also to build a list, because I very early on, although I started as a freelancer, I knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, where the difference is that a freelancer trades time for money and an entrepreneur earns money even if they are not working. So an entrepreneur is basically building a system around a value proposition so that they don't have to trade time for money in exact. And the podcast I was listening back then and what I learned at conferences and these masterminds for entrepreneurs was that we have to build a list. This means we have to get people to sign up for our newsletter so that we do not depend on social media or any other platforms to reach people, but that we can reach them directly in their email mailboxes. And this matters because we want to speak to those who are potentially interested in our services. So that's also why I started to write the one-page summaries. So for every episode, I listen to it again after it's recorded, and I would sit down to think of what are my key takeaways, what are the wisdom nuggets, and what are the things that I would put on a one-page summary. And then I offered to the audience to download this free one-page summary in exchange to their email address, with the hope and the goal that if I can build trust over time by sharing my voice in their email inbox, eventually they might become clients. Fun fact, back then in 2019, I didn't even know what I would be selling. Because as I mentioned, I was a freelancer. I hosted workshops, I designed workshops, But my main client was the European Investment Bank, for which I organized, designed, and hosted the summer school. So this was also a facilitated work and still quite different from what I would do today. Today, I'm building an agency. So I have finally arrived at the space where I am an entrepreneur, where I work with multinationals who need corporate training. And I like to say that we are like a Trojan horse of corporate training. So we come in, we deliver training sessions, but what actually happens throughout the sessions is that we help participants to connect to each other before connecting to the content. So we're creating the spaces where collaborative cultures can grow. And by we, I mean my associates that deliver the workshops on behalf of my company, which then makes me an entrepreneur. This was a small bracket, and I'm deviating again. So this becomes Myriam's tells a story of her life kind of podcast recording. And I hope you enjoy it. So I started the one-page summaries as means to build my list because I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And who knows when I have to speak to potential leads, to potential clients. And I continue doing it because it is my opportunity to actually listen again to the podcast interviews and to learn, because I realized that when I'm focused on the conversation itself, I'm so immersed in the topic that I don't necessarily remember every detail of what we've talked about. If I listen to it afterwards, then I get these light bulb moments again. And if I then take notes, I'm sure that I will remember. And that's why today in the work that I'm doing, I can really use these 300 episodes, 299, that I've recorded as source of inspiration, also to help my clients, my coaching clients, to help them improve their workshop agendas and design better trainings and better programs for their groups and clients. And with episode 300, I will actually stop offering all the past one-page summaries for free because I have gained confidence as an entrepreneur and realized that I'm offering a lot for free already. I made the conscious decision not to put older episodes or half episodes or whatsoever behind pay walls, because I think that the more people we can reach, the more people can learn to design better workshops, create better collaborative spaces and meetings, the better. So why would we hide this from any listener? But still, the work that I'm doing with the one-page summaries can contribute to funding this podcast. So instead of putting the podcast behind paywalls, I will now really promote the ebooks, where we have assembled always 100 summaries together and we sell them for 10 euros. So that's why we're stopping to give free access to the older summaries. What I will continue is to send out the one-page summaries for every new episodes to those who have subscribed to my newsletter so that we can keep in touch. Yes, because that's nice. Those who have followed my podcast might have realized that I'm very rigorous in the process. So I want to share what my process behind the scene is and what my, let's call it, philosophy is when I record podcast episodes with the guests. In terms of process, as soon as I have detected a guest, I will have a exploration call that is between 10 minutes and 40 minutes long. I think I also had exploration calls that were over an hour long that could have been podcasts episodes already, but this is not the aim. The aim is really to get a sense of the chemistry. So is this person someone with whom I could imagine to have a 1.5 hour long conversation with? Because I realized that it's not necessarily about the content. It's not about the experience or the expertise that someone has, but it's about this chemistry, whether I can inspire the person to think new thoughts for the first time and articulate them, whether they can inspire me to ask them curious questions. because I'm really, really curiosity driven. So I invite everyone to an exploration call, and I stop the exploration call usually as soon as I want to hear more. As soon as I'm taking notes, because I have so many questions that I want to ask this person, this is the moment where I stop the exploration so that I can keep my curiosity to the actual interview, which also means that I do very little research about my podcast guests, which has led to situations where I had entire interviews not touching upon the one topic that my guest was actually known for, just because the conversation didn't lead to that, which is, on the one hand, a bummer, of course, because it could have been an opportunity to learn more about their superpowers and what they're actually known for. On the other hand, it also shows that people have so many more layers, and we might then find out something about them that we wouldn't have otherwise if we're just so focused on what they stand for and what they're known for. I also stop an exploration call if I don't feel the chemistry. This is usually, I can detect that in the first 2 minutes. There's something about it, how someone would introduce themselves, how comfortable they feel immediately, how comfortable I feel, and whether there is a component of teaching in it. And I might be a little bit extreme on that. And those who were in the Never Done Before community will recognize it, that I don't like to be told or to be taught. And maybe it's my small t trauma from having spent so much time in academia and at university, that I believe that we learn best when we learn out of curiosity. So, of course, I want to learn from my guest, and I want them to tell me stories and me to ask curious questions. And then I'm open to the learning on behalf of my audience. And if someone comes and tells me or teaches me, I lose the connection with that person. And then I don't see any reason to have them on my podcast. And I'm very blunt about that. Not always to the benefit or to the pleasure of my non-guest, but I learned over the years, I grew the confidence that it's my podcast and I can decide who my guests are and what kind of conversations I want to have, which was not an easy growth path, but I think an important one, because I also realized that there were a few episodes that I recorded where I did not feel safe, I did not feel comfortable because I was talked at. And at some point, I decided that I don't want that for myself. I want to only post episodes that I really enjoyed and loved, that I believe my audience will learn from and enjoy at least as much as I did when I recorded them. So after the exploration call, we schedule a recording date if we go further. And about a week before the recording, I send them a set of sample questions that I usually don't ask. And I would also tell them that, okay, these are the set of questions that I most likely won't ask you, but they give us a sense of false certainty. Because I realized that for many of my guests, it is the first podcast that they've recorded. And that's quite exciting. I think I was excited for the first 25 episodes that I recorded, because it's a space where you don't know what will happen, and you know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who will listen to it. So I sent them some sample questions, and it's important for me to tell them that I won't necessarily ask these questions, because for me, the flow of the conversation, the emergence is more important than the script. And I would not want, and I had that before, that a guest would then read out answers or have rehearsed the answers to the questions, because then it becomes a real interview rather than a conversation. And I think if we're too focused on the questions that we want to ask, or me personally, then I would not be open to listen to the small hints that someone, or the breadcrumbs that they will put on the way. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let me double click on that. And then it has happened that we agreed to record a podcast on a specific topic. And within the first 5 minutes, we totally went off track and spoke about something very different, just because this was what was present in the moment for both of us. And we hoped that it would still be interesting for the podcast audience. So we just went with it. So that's why I say these are questions that I most likely don't ask. And then we record. I schedule for 1.5 hours so that we have a little bit of buffer at the beginning and have a little bit of a debriefing at the end. And usually the recordings are, close to 1.5 hours long. And I do have an editor, Gordon, who has been with me since episode 26. So the first 25, I did the editing myself, a very painful process, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then I realized that this is not time well spent. And I think Gordon has listened to my voice more than any other human being on this planet. And fun fact, I think the first time I was in a conversation with him, so the first time I heard his voice was maybe after 200 episodes. And from the beginning, I've also worked with a team to repurpose the content. Initially, I had an agency that helped me to create the artwork and write the show notes and to publish the podcast on social media. I have then started working with a copywriter and with an assistant. So Jenny has supported me with the podcast, creating the images. I don't know, maybe for 250 episodes now. And Joe has been my copywriter for 200 episodes. And then I switched and am now working with Imi, which is a wonderful support in the sense that they listen to the podcast with a very different ear and then summarize it in a beautiful nutshell that elevates it from just the content. And I'll be very honest, I did try ChatGPT or other AI solutions to write the show notes and realized that it will never be as good. Whenever I compare what ChatGPT comes up with and what my copywriters come up with, it's just ages apart, because it makes a difference whether a human picks out what is really relevant for them and adds their playful touch to it. And this process really helps me save lots of time. So I still record all the episodes myself, obviously, and I still write the one-page summaries and the show notes I've never written myself. And as AI might get better, I will stick to my human copywriters. And I think that's the one thing that I realized when I interviewed ChatGPT when it came out in 2020. I realized that, yes, the content was amazing. Obviously, it was even nuanced. But what I realized is that it's not about the content. It's about the chemistry. It's about the awe, the curiosity. It's about the playfulness that makes a great podcast episode and that makes great copy. And while ChatGPT might be able to summarize all the different aspects that we have touched upon in a conversation, it won't be able to distinguish what's relevant from what's irrelevant. And for this, we still need humans. And we might always need humans, because what is relevant for me might not be relevant for you. So it's a very subjective summary and perspective on what we have discussed on the podcast. And what keeps me recording all these podcasts, or what keeps me spending, let's say, a day per week on the podcast, is really the curiosity and my passion for having amazing conversations. And I recorded a solo episode. I think it was 288, because this is basically what I try to create and what I am seeking for myself. And this is what keeps me recording, because there are amazing facilitators out there and a lot of experts who don't call themselves facilitators and still do facilitative work. And I love learning from them and love making it available to the audience, because I think what we do need is more spaces for curiosity and collaboration, and more safe spaces. And for me, facilitation at its core means creating psychological safety. And I think that's one of the main learnings from the show, that what I shared before, it's not about the content, it's about the passion and the curiosity. And facilitation as its core is not about the activities, it's not about the methods, but it's about the psychological safety that we create for groups so that individuals can really become the best versions of themselves, can dare to think thoughts for the first time, can dare to articulate them, dare to build on the ideas of others, dare to look behind what's been done before. And in order to create this space, or this container, as facilitators call it, we have to be strong enough to hold it, because we will get triggered, or as Maggie Culture says, activated, because we do have our own opinions. Yes, we want to be neutral. We must be neutral towards the outcome of a workshop, but we cannot be neutral towards every participant. We cannot be neutral towards their behavior, the way they articulate themselves, because we're human beings. And there are participants who will remind us of the bully we knew at school, or the mother who always complains about how we're dressed, or the father who has told us that we have to improve and we were never good enough. And these participants, it's not their fault that they remind us of these individuals. So it's on us to be very clear in distinguishing it, and to hold back so that we can show up without judgment. And I've learned that there's not one way to facilitate. Once we have the basics right, once we did the inner work so that we don't get activated by participants, once we know how to create the space of psychological safety so that we don't judge, and once we are neutral towards the outcome so that we're also curious, and once we are also nimble enough to deviate from what we have planned so that we can meet the needs of the group, then there's no right way of doing it. And there are facilitators who have an agenda and who work through it, and I'm one of them, and felt bad for it for a very long time, because I thought, as a master facilitator, it's best not to have an agenda and to work with emergence. And it really depends. It depends on the group. It depends on us. What do we feel comfortable with? I love to craft my workshop agenda and these moments of manipulation so that I can really craft the journey of the participants so that they get where they wanted to go when they signed up for it. Obviously, which doesn't mean that I would stick to it if I realized that maybe they needed something else that I wasn't aware of. And it was at the last Never Done Before festival that I realized that, for me personally, really the high art of facilitation is the ability to be very informal as a human. So, and informal in a way that it creates the space where participants also dare to just be themselves, where we can be human together, basically. So this clear informality while holding a very strong container for difficult topics to be discussed. And to observe that in real time was absolutely magic. And it was Charles-Louis Demar and Tennyson Wolfe that I observed in particular doing that, which was absolutely beautiful. And it's a very different way of facilitation, as also at the festival, Lily Higgins and Steph Clark, who created an entire experience for the participants that I've never experienced before. A mix between storytelling and using a mirror board in an immersive way, which was absolutely stunning. And why did I tell that? Oh yeah, because there's no right or wrong way to facilitate as long as we have the basics right. One thread that I left at the very beginning of this solo episode and that I want to pick up again is never done before, and the idea that the podcast has basically contributed to everything that I've done as a business. When I started my freelance business, I called it iDays, Idea Days. Nobody understood what I meant. I am very stubborn, so it took me, I think, 1.5 or 2 years until I finally realized that iDays was not the right business name. So I rebranded and used Workshops.work, which was the name of the podcast already, and I thought that was fitting. And it was through the podcast that I found the first clients, or the first clients found me. And it was through the podcast that I got and created the network to build Never Done Before, which started as a festival during the pandemic. And I reached out to podcast guests asking them if they want to be, if they want to host a workshop at the festival, under the only condition that they have to do something they've never done before. And this grew into a community, which then also inspired the podcast. Obviously, I found new guests through the community. And it also, really informed my facilitation practice to be so close to other master facilitators and observing them, their practice, and to be a participant again. So if I could give advice to any facilitator out there, is not to stop participating, because we learn so much from being in the role of someone who sits in someone else's workshop and just realizing what feels good and what doesn't feel good. How safe do we feel, and why? What instructions land and which instructions don't? And what is a sequence of activities that flows and others that feels a little bit uncomfortable, bulky? And I think only if we experience this with the participant hat on, while keeping the facilitation lens open, this is how we can really become better facilitators. And by doing the inner work. I recorded an episode on my inner work through Vipassana meditation, and I will surely record more of that. I'm also planning to record an episode on the topic of psychological safety, which is so close to my heart. And I think everything that we do in facilitation really boils down to that. Yeah, and this also shows you that I have grown over the past 300 weeks, where in the beginning I did not dare to take the space to record a solo episode because I thought that the audience might not be interested, or who am I to, or it's not my space to take place. All these thoughts that were in my mind. And now I receive positive feedback after the solo episodes I've recorded. I have listeners to the podcast reaching out and encouraging me because they have questions and want to know also my perspective. And at the end of the day, it's also a nice practice for myself to be able to articulate my thoughts. But this episode was not here to articulate my thoughts, but to share my story so that you can get a little bit of an understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. One thing that I haven't touched upon is, how do I find my guests? In the beginning, it was really, as I mentioned, friends and friends of friends that I interviewed, mostly in person. With the pandemic, I totally switched to Zoom. So I still record on Zoom, because on Zoom you can actually record separate audio tracks for each participant. This makes it easier and it's accessible. I've tried some other podcast-specific recording tools, but I found them not as smooth. And there are 3 ways how I find my guests. Either I meet them in a workshop, on social media, I somehow become aware of their sharing their work, and I'm intrigued, and then, or I read their book, and then invite them to the show. And in 99% of the cases, I also ask them for an exploration call beforehand. A few times I did not have the exploration call, which went still right, maybe in 50% of the cases. In the other 50%, I afterwards regretted that I let my process down. Then I get more and more recommendations for podcast guests. And what I'm doing now is at the end of a podcast interview, after the recording, I'm asking my guests who they could recommend to the show, because I realized that the friends of those I enjoyed the conversation with, if they're preferred conversation partners, are most likely also some of my preferred conversation partners. So that's what I most do at the moment. Very, very rarely I accept guests who have been approached through PR agencies. There are more and more PR agencies recommending facilitators, speakers, leaders, authors to the show. But in most cases, it doesn't really speak to me because of this aspect that I have the impression that they try to sell me something. And almost never I would invite someone who suggests themselves for the show. I receive lots of messages, lots of emails from facilitators who would like to come on the show, that at some point I decided that I am favoring introductions or my own gut feel when I come across someone, just to make the process easier for myself. Yeah, and that's about it. I have not talked about my personal life. I have not talked to what comes after NDB, because I will cover that in a different channel. And my personal life, I do share from time to time on a podcast episode. It's not that I'm making a big secret out of it, but I find it kind of weird to talk to you about my private life without having been asked. So also on Instagram, I don't share private pictures or anything. I think what you're signing up for is facilitation content, leadership, psychological safety. These are the topics that I love talking about: human behavior, group dynamics. And what I do in my private life, I don't think that it's very interesting. So yeah, that's why I'm keeping this out. I think this episode is long enough in any case, and I hope you enjoyed it. Send me an email if you did, and let me know what caught your curiosity. And if you do have a question, then maybe I'll answer it in the next podcast episode. Thank you for listening. And I hope that you will continue to listen to the next 300 episodes or so. Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.